Okay. As we were saying, conventional ethical relativism is based on two premises. The first premise, as we looked at already, was the diversity thesis. The idea that different cultures have different moral practices. The other premise on which the argument is based is that which is known as the dependency thesis. In the dependency thesis says whether an act is right or wrong depends upon the place, depends upon the culture within which it takes place. The idea of the dependency thesis, rather, is that in different places, different cultures, a certain act might be right or it might be wrong. For example, in the United States, it's possible that, for example, well, let's ask about a particular act. As we were saying, is it right or is it wrong for a woman to drive a car? Well, in the United States, it's not a problem. Women drive cars all the time. That's not a problem. That's something that's universally practiced. Whether one is able to drive or not is not dependent upon their sex, their gender, or anything else like that. However, if you were to go to Afghanistan, say 20 years ago, 1998, and you as a woman were to try to go outside of your house and drive a car and just drive down the road, that would have been not only immoral but also illegal. It would have been illegal for you to go out of the house. In fact, it would be illegal for you to go out of the house without a male escort. It was a crime that was punishable by a public caning. They would whip you in public, Hunger Games style, strap you to the log in the middle of the city square and just beat you. That was the punishment for that. So is a woman driving a car, is that moral or is it not moral? Well, the dependency thesis would say, well, whether that act is moral or not depends on where it takes place. Does it take place in the United States or does it take place in Afghanistan? And so that would be the answer there. Now, both of these the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis are premises in an argument that seeks to conclude that there are no universal moral principles. So that's it. The diversity thesis: different cultures have different moral practices. The dependency thesis: whether an act is right or wrong depends on the culture within which it takes place. And the conclusion being there are no universal moral principles. Is this the question that we ask ourselves is this a good argument? It's an argument. It's certainly an argument based on premises, but is this a good argument? And that's what we want to look at. I want to offer you, by way of answering this, the critique of a philosopher named James Rachels, who took cultural relativism and broke it down, including the argument that we see before us right now, and then also some implications of the argument in order to give a critique on it. And so what I'm going to offer you right now is his critique. And this is what he says. The first thing he wants to do is evaluate the diversity thesis. Different cultures have different moral practices. But do they really have different moral practices? You see, James Rachel says, practices may differ, but the values, the underlying values of those practices are the same. Now, if we go back to the example of that was offered of King Darius that Ruth Benedict talked about, where King Darius has the Greeks and the Colossians in there and the funerary practices of both of them, and the conclusion that culture just tells what's right or wrong in the situations. Rachel says, think about that example for just a minute. Think about it because the Greeks, why did they do what they did? They put the body out on a funeral pyre, they washed it, they put coins on its eyes, and then they lit it on fire. Why did they do that? Well, according to Greek culture and Greek beliefs, the belief system, the idea was that the body was bad and that the soul was good. That the body was a kind of a prison for the soul. And so in order to release the soul from the body, if you really truly loved and honored that person, you would want to do that as quickly as possible. Otherwise, the soul would remain in the body until the body decomposed. And so in order to do this, what they would do is they would burn the body in order to release the soul. Now, why did you put the coins on their eyes? Well, for the Greeks, when the soul was released from the body, it wanted to go to the underworld, but it couldn't quite get there because it had to cross the river Styx. And in order to cross the river Styx, they had the soul had to go to a ghost ferryman, and the ghost his name was Charon, and the soul would have to pay in order to have the ferryman ferry him to the other side of the river. And so the idea behind all of this was that the Greeks were honoring their dead in order to provide for their continued existence as easily and painlessly as possible. They wanted their loved ones to live on in the next world. And so that's why they did it. That was part of their belief system. They wanted to honor the dead and provide for their continued existence. Well, if you go over to the Galatians and you ask them, well, why did you do the things that you did? Well, why did you eat the body of your loved one? Well, the Galatians believed something a little bit different about the afterlife than the Greeks did. You see, the Galatians believed that, not in the immortality of the soul, if you will, but they believed that a person could live on through the physical nature of their loved ones. And so if I loved my forefather and they died, I would want to take that by eating certain parts of their body. I would take their spirit in me, or I would take their energy, their genius, or the potency of their life into myself, so that they could live on through me. It was a way, again, of providing for a continued existence and honoring the dead. And so in both cases, what we see is while the practices may have differed, burning the body or eating the body, the goal was the same, and the value was the same. It was to honor the one that you loved who had died, and to provide for their continued existence. And this is what Rachel's is talking about. And he says, we see these practices that these cultures do, and they're very different from one another, but the underlying values of the cultures are very, very similar. In fact, this has become known as the idea of core morality. Core morality is the idea that there's a certain group of moral values that every society that has ever flourished, they have to espouse those values, or the society dies. For example, the respect for human life. If a culture does not respect human life, then the culture they can't even get off the ground. Because people, remember our talk about the state of nature, and the people are always stabbing each other in the back, and they're worried about who's going to get them, and this sort of thing. If the culture does not recognize the value of human life, then it's doomed. Similarly, if the culture does not recognize the value of truth-telling, then communication cannot take place. And contracts can't be made, and art and education and culture can't be developed, simply because communication cannot take place apart from the assumption that truth-telling is a valuable thing. And so there are moral principles that every culture that succeeds is going to recognize in order to provide for human flourishing, without which these cultures would have nowhere to go, nothing to do. So that's core morality. And James Rachels believes that core morality is essential to understanding morality. This set of moral values every culture has in common. They may express it differently through moral practices, but the values are the same. And so the diversity thesis, he says, I don't think gets it right. The diversity thesis is wrong because the values, the moral values of every culture are very, very similar, even if their practice is fleshed out in diverse ways. So that's the diversity thesis. What about the dependency thesis? The idea that whether an act is right or wrong depends upon the culture in which it takes place. Well, Rachel's at this point takes a different tact. The first one, he just flat out contradicts it. He says it's not true. When viewed from a certain perspective, the diversity thesis is absolutely false. The dependency thesis, however, he takes a different tact. Instead of challenging whether it's true or not, he says, you know what? The truthfulness of this statement, if it is true, if this statement is true or if this statement is not true, we're not even gonna consider that for a minute. What I want us to do, he says, is look at this and see that the dependency thesis is actually a different way of stating the conclusion. You see, the only way that the dependency thesis is true is if there are no such thing as universal moral principles. You say, okay, so what? Well, here's the problem. The conclusion of the argument is that there is no such thing as universal moral principles. The dependency thesis is simply a restatement of that conclusion. In other words, it's not adding to anything. There's nothing else. It's just a restatement of that conclusion. The only way, though, that the dependency thesis is true is if the conclusion is true. Well, what if the dependency thesis is false? Then the conclusion is false. You see, what the argument here does is that it assumes the conclusion in the premise. That, by the way, when you simply restate your conclusion and it's present in one of your premises, that's called circular reasoning. It's the same thing as if you said, universal principles are not true, therefore universal principles are not true. Or universal principles are not true because I don't think that universal principles exist. It's just simply a way of restating the premise in the conclusion, and that is not a valid form of argumentation. It is an invalid argument. And so the dependency thesis suffers from a formal fallacy of circular reasoning, where you include the conclusion in your premise. So the dependency thesis cannot be good. So what we see is that conventional ethical relativism, the argument for it, the diversity thesis suffers from the idea that it might very well be false. The dependency thesis itself isn't even valid because it's a formal fallacy. Therefore, the argument does not prove the conclusion. Now, just because the argument doesn't prove the conclusion, though, is not necessarily an indication that the conclusion itself is false. It's possible that the conclusion is true even if this argument doesn't work for it. And so Rachel says, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that the conclusion is true, that morals come from individual cultures, and that's it. He says, what if we take that seriously? What if we follow through consistently with that reasoning and try to live out the implications of that assumption that morals come from individual cultures? What if we do that? Well, if we take it seriously, there are implications. And the question Rachel asks is, once we're aware of those implications, is it even possible to live consistently with them? He asks, what about the practice of sati? Now, if you don't know what that is, the practice of sati is a practice that used to be practiced by some Indian Hindu cultures. And the practice was this: whenever a man would die, they would put him on his funeral pyre to burn his body. And then they would put his wife or wives on the funeral pyre with him, and they were perfectly alive. And they were expected to be burned alive along with their husband because he wanted, that was just their practice. What about that? Is that a moral practice? Let's consider that for a moment. If we were to, a lot of times this was done not because of the will of the wife involved. In other words, in order to get her to sit still, they would tie her to the funeral pyre and let her burn to death. Is that a moral thing to do? Well, we would look at that. If we saw that happening in the city park, we would think that would be abhorrent. We would do whatever it took to stop it. We would call the police, and the police would come in, and they would put a stop to it. We would do whatever it takes, right? Because we see that as an evil or a terrible thing. Let's look at that for just a minute. if conventional ethical relativism is true and we were to take it seriously and try to live by it, one of the implications is this: we can no longer claim that our culture's morals are superior to any other. We can no longer say, for example, that our culture and the way that we bury our dead is any more morally superior to the practice of sati. That they are not wrong for burning their living wives of a man on his funeral pyre. We cannot critique that as morally wrong. Now, we might say that we wouldn't do that in our culture, or we might go so far as to say that it is immoral to do in our culture. But we can't say that they're doing it is wrong. Now, why is that? Well, because in conventional ethical relativism, our culture gets our moral principles from within our culture, and so it's something of a sealed circle, if you will. Our culture is, and we see here that our culture gets its moral cues from within this circle. Nothing from outside can influence what our culture can tell our culture, critique our culture as evil. On the other hand, there's the Indian or the Hindu culture when this was practiced, and their culture is a sealed culture, and from within that circle, nobody can tell them, or from within that culture, everything is judged from within that culture. Nobody from the outside can tell them that what they're doing is wrong, because what they're doing is judged by inside their culture. You see, in order for us to say that our culture is better than theirs, in order to critique this act of widow burning, there would have to be a common moral law that overarched both of our cultures, so that we could look at this moral law that stood outside of our culture and compare it to the practice that's going on inside this culture, and then be able to say that this is a bad practice or an evil practice. Well, in cultural relativism, that moral law doesn't exist. That overarching moral law doesn't exist, so we have no basis to say that our culture is superior to that, or that their culture is superior to ours. Because this moral law that would give us that information, it doesn't exist in cultural relativism. Rachel says, look, if you're going to be consistent, if you're going to espouse cultural relativism, be consistent with it. And if you're going to be consistent, you cannot claim that the practices of your culture are superior to any other. Now, at this point, there may be some who are willing to say, okay, I get that. But I still believe that cultural relativism is the right way to go. I don't like the idea that widow burning, that I would have to say that our culture can't say that it's bad. But ultimately, that's what they do in their culture, and it's good for them. Okay? Understand that this argument, if we think that this is some sort of disembodied abstraction, understand that this deals with very real life events. In the Nuremberg trials following World War II, Adolf Eichmann was on trial for his life. He was, of course, a leader in the Nazi SS, and he was asked why he did the things that he did to the Jews and other people. And Eichmann's response was this. He said, we were just obeying orders. In other words, what he was saying is, look, within the German culture, killing Jews was the way to go. It's what we did. We were following orders, and no one from the outside could come in and tell us that what we were doing was wrong, because our culture was judging right and wrong from within our own culture. What right do you have to impose your cultural values on us? Now, that was a defense offered by Adolf Eichmann, a man who was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people. Are we willing to let that go? Are we willing to live consistently by saying that our culture is no better than that of the Nazis? I don't think any of us really believe that. But even if you do believe that, there's another implication of taking cultural relativism seriously, and that is this: if we take cultural relativism seriously, then we cannot say that we have progressed morally as a culture. We cannot say that we have progressed morally as a culture. Now, think about this. Has our culture, let's say since 1818, let's say the United States in 1818, has it progressed morally in the since 1818 until now, 2018? So in the last 200 years, think of the things that are different, morally speaking, in our culture. Think of the difference between the way that, for example, slaves were treated back then to now how people who have descended from slaves are treated. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is have we advanced in our views toward race? Now, that's not to say that our views toward race and the issue of racism does not need to be addressed. It's not to say that we've come to some perfect conclusion of the problem of racism, not by a stretch. But I would say that we have progressed somewhat. You see, because in 1818, people taught that you could own an individual based on their race. That certain races were closer to animals than they were to humans. They would say that certain races didn't have souls, and so they justified enslaving them and treating them horribly, and treating them as property. At least today, slavery is illegal. At least today, the idea of being racist is frowned upon by society in general. That doesn't mean that we don't have racists. We certainly do. But racism at least is condemned unequivocally in virtually every aspect of society. Or what about women's rights? Have women's rights progressed since 1818? Well, sure they have. Because in 1818, a woman couldn't own property. A woman could not get an education. She couldn't hold a job. She couldn't do many of the things that women can do now. Now, have we come all the way that we should be? Are men and women completely equal? Well, that's arguable. No, I think there's some progress that could be made. Nevertheless, the plight of women has dramatically been improved in the last couple hundred years. And we can mention many other things. But we see that there has been a change. Excuse me. If we are going to take conventional relativism seriously, however, think about this. We see a change that has taken place between 1818 and 2018. But in order for the idea of progress to be advanced here, what we have to say is things were worse than they are now. And we have progressed from then to a better place now, and hopefully we're going to progress to a better place in the future. In other words, in order to say progress, we have to say that this is better than this. This culture is better than this culture. But remember from the last illustration, in order to do that, we have to have that moral law that overarches both societies. In cultural relativism, where individual actions are judged from within this circle, though, we don't have that. We don't have that. And so we cannot say that this is better than this. We cannot say that we have made progress. We cannot say that we've come a long way. Now, many people might hear that, and they might still say, okay, I see what you're saying there, but I still believe that the idea that cultural relativism is serious. That it's true. This is the way that we should do ethics. Well, there's one more implication that Rachel talks about, and I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that many of us would agree with that we could live consistently with this. That is this. If we take conventional relativism seriously, then initiating moral progress is itself immoral. Initiating moral progress itself is immoral. Think about our two societies here. When we initiate moral progress, what are we doing? Well, look here. We are living in our society right here. And we are, when we initiate moral progress, imagining a society that is ideal, one wherein we get rid of the moral issues of our day or we improve upon them. Kind of like Dr. King when he gave his I Have a Dream speech. He was living in a society that was very racist and had tremendous problems with discrimination. And he said when he was giving his speech that I have a dream that one day all of this will be gone. I have a dream that one day that the races will be considered equal, that the people from both races will regard one another as fellow man and fellow equal with one another. I have a dream, he said. I have a dream of an ideal society. Now, he wasn't living in that society, but he was dreaming of that society. And he was initiating moral progress to try to get from here to move to here. That's what he was trying to do. He was initiating moral progress. But here's the problem. If we are living in our society and the way that our society is composed is largely dictating to us the morals of our society, then anytime I go outside of that moral structure and say that this one is better, I am proposing something that is against the morals of my society. And that, in that context, is wrong. Why? Because again, there's no moral law that says that we can point to that says that this is a better society than this. We might say we prefer this, but if we do that within the context of cultural relativism, all that we're saying is that we are at odds with society as it exists, and that is immoral. In order for us to say that this one is genuinely better than this one, there has to be, again, that moral law that overarches both of us, so that we can look outside of our society at the moral law and say that this would be better. But in cultural relativism, that moral law does not exist, and we cannot do that. Therefore, if we try to initiate moral progress, we are being immoral. Now, I don't know of a single human being that I know who would say that the world as it exists and the culture that I live in as it exists right now is perfect. Every one of us has an idea for improvement, even if we would disagree on the nature of that improvement. Nevertheless, I think that some things can be improved, and I assume that probably you think some things could be improved as well. If we believe that, then what we're saying is that our culture is not the ultimate arbiter of what is right and wrong. Something outside of it is. Something outside of it is the ideal. Something else, and we look to something outside of our culture as it exists now, and we strive for that. That means that we don't believe that cultural relativism is the way to go. No matter how much lip service we want to pay to it, our practice betrays the truth that we believe in a higher standard of justice, a higher standard of rightness, a higher standard of morality that exists outside of our culture. That would land us in objective ethics. That's what we'll look at next time. Thank you very much.